Everyone feared the mountain man until a fat teenage girl melted his heart. Snow falls on a lonely frontier town. Mothers pull their children close as the scarred giant rides in, silent and feared by all. But in the livery barn, a trembling girl shivers. Her uncle traded her for whiskey. No one wants her. The sheriff sneers, ready to cast her out. Then the mountain man drops a silver coin. His voice rumbles. "She comes with me." Gasps echo, whispers rise. What kind of life awaits her in his shack on the mountain's edge? Some say he's a killer, some say he's cursed. But behind his silence lies grief, and behind her tears lies a strength no one sees. When sickness, greed, and gossip close in, their bond will be tested by fire. Will this unlikely pair become family, or will the mountain claim them both? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The snow fell thick and steady over Granite Bluff, coating the muddy street in white. Mothers hurriedly gathered their children from the wooden boardwalk, pulling them close as the massive figure of Ephraim Boone appeared through the swirling flakes. His mule's hooves crunched in the fresh snow, the only sound breaking the sudden hush that fell over the street. Boone sat tall in his saddle, his broad shoulders wrapped in a threadbare coat dusted with snow. Deep scars crossed his weathered face, telling tales of violence that made townsfolk look away. He rarely came to town except for supplies, and when he did, people cleared a path. Inside the livery barn, 14-year-old Lydia Mae Thompson huddled in the corner, trying to stop her teeth from chattering. The smell of hay and horse filled her nose as she wrapped her arms around herself, her patched dress offering little warmth. Her uncle had traded her away for whiskey just that morning, leaving her alone with nothing but the clothes on her back and the memory of his stumbling departure. Sheriff Mills paced the wooden floor, his boots leaving wet prints in the dust. "Can't keep her here," he muttered, clearly annoyed. "Someone's got to claim her, or she'll have to move on. Town ain't running a charity." Lydia pressed herself smaller against the rough wall, her heart pounding. She knew what people thought when they looked at her. A burden, too big to feed, too plain to marry off. Tears burned in her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. Her mama hadn't raised her to break easy, even if she wasn't here anymore to say so. The livery door creaked open, letting in a blast of cold air and the imposing figure of Ephraim Boone. Snow melted on his shoulders as he ducked to enter, his presence filling the space like a shadow. The sheriff's hand twitched toward his gun belt, more habit than intent. "Boone." Sheriff Mills nodded cautiously. "Don't often see you in town this time of year." The mountain man's eyes moved from the sheriff to Lydia, his expression unreadable beneath his beard. Outside, townsfolk gathered at the windows, their faces pale circles in the growing dark. Their whispers carried through the thin walls. "Who'd want such a burden? Girl that sized eat you out of house and home. Ain't natural, trading your own kin for drink." Lydia felt each word like a slap, but she lifted her chin, meeting Boone's gaze. If she was going to be turned out, she'd face it, standing tall, like her mama would have wanted. Boone's rough hand moved to his coat pocket, pulling out a silver dollar that gleamed in the dim light. Without a word, he tossed it onto the counter, the coin ringing against the wood. "She comes with me," he said, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. A collective gasp rose from the watchers outside. Sheriff Mills's mouth fell open, then snapped shut. Even the horses seemed to quiet, sensing the weight of the moment. "Now see here, Boone," the sheriff started, but fell silent when the profferan mountain man's dark eyes turned his way. Lydia's heart thundered in her chest. Everyone knew Ephraim Boone's reputation, everyone, the violence in his past, the way he lived alone up in the hills, speaking to no one. But when he looked at her again, she saw something in his eyes that the others missed. Something that reminded her of the way her mama used to look at her. Like she was worth something. "Your choice, girl," Boone said quietly, speaking to her directly for the first time. "Stay or come, your say." Lydia stood slowly, her legs shaking beneath her skirts. The barn was cold, the town hostile, and her future uncertain. But in Boone's gruff offer, she sensed a chance, maybe her only one. She took a step forward, then another, watching his face for any sign of mockery or cruelty. She found none. Just patience, and perhaps a glimmer of something else. Understanding, maybe, or recognition of a shared loneliness. "I'll come," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Boone nodded once, then turned toward the door. Lydia followed, feeling the shocked stares of the townsfolk as she stepped out into the snow. Their whispers followed her, but for the first time that day, they didn't sting quite as much. The snow was falling harder now, but Boone's broad back blocked the worst of it as he led the way to his mule. Lydia took each step carefully, moving from the known dangers of Granite Bluff toward an uncertain future with this silent, scarred man who had claimed her when no one else would. The mountain path wound upward through stands of snow-laden pine, their branches hanging low under their white burden. Boone's mule picked its way carefully along the trail while Lydia May clung to the saddle horn, her knuckles white with cold and fear. Boone walked ahead, leading the mule by its rope, his boots breaking trail through the fresh snow. Every step took them further from town, further from people who might hear her scream. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs as she imagined what fate awaited her. She'd heard whispered stories about men who lived alone in the mountains, about the things they did to girls who disappeared. Her teeth chattered, not just from the cold. The sun was setting behind the mountains when they finally reached a small clearing. A rough-hewn cabin stood at its edge, dark against the whiteness. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, telling of a fire left banking inside. Nearby stood a lean-to shelter filled with split wood, and beyond that, a small barn that looked barely big enough for the mule. Boone helped her down from the saddle, his huge hands gentle despite their strength. Lydia stumbled on legs numb from riding, catching herself against the cabin wall. The mountain man led his mule to the barn without a word, leaving her alone by the cabin door. She could run. The thought came quick and desperate. But where? The snow was falling heavier now, and darkness gathered between the trees. She'd freeze before she made it halfway down the mountain. The cabin door creaked open behind her. "Come in," Boone said gruffly. "Night's falling." Lydia stepped inside, blinking in the dim light. The cabin was small but neat, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. Shelves lined another wall, holding jars and bundles of dried meat. A single bed stood in the corner, its quilt worn but clean. A table, 2 chairs, and a trunk completed the sparse furnishings. Boone moved past her to stir the fire, adding fresh logs until flames leaped up the chimney. The warmth reached toward Lydia, drawing her closer despite her fear. She watched as he pulled a rolled blanket from the trunk. "Take the bed," he said, spreading the blanket near the hearth. "I'll sleep here." Lydia stared at him, not understanding. "Sir? Bed's yours." He didn't look at her as he arranged his makeshift pallet. "Get some rest." Slowly, still watching him for any sudden moves, Lydia edged toward the bed. The quilt smelled of pine smoke when she pulled it back. She kept her dress on as she lay down, ready to run if she had to. In the firelight, Boone settled on his blanket, pulling out a knife and whetstone. The steady scrape of steel against stone filled the cabin as he worked. Lydia watched through half-closed eyes, her body tense. The mountain man's face was lost in shadow, but something in his expression seemed far away, haunted. His hands moved automatically over the blade, while his thoughts clearly wandered down darker paths. A muscle twitched in his jaw, and his shoulders hunched as if bearing some invisible weight. Lydia couldn't help the small sob that escaped her then, thinking of her mama's gentle hands, of the uncle who'd traded her away like a sack of grain. She tried to muffle the sound in the quilt, but it came anyway. Boone's hands stilled on the knife. For a long moment, he sat motionless, then deliberately turned his back to her, though his shoulders remained stiff with awareness of her presence. Time crept by. The fire popped and settled. Outside, an owl called once, then fell silent. Eventually, exhaustion pulled Lydia into an uneasy sleep. Her prayers for protection whispered into the darkness. She woke to gray dawn light filtering through the cabin's single window and the smell of beans simmering over the fire. Boone stood at the hearth, stirring a pot hung from an iron hook. His blanket was already rolled and stored away. Without turning, he reached for a tin plate on the shelf. He filled it with steaming beans and held it out to her. "Eat," he said simply. "You'll need strength here." Lydia sat up slowly, her muscles stiff from the previous day's ride. She took the plate with trembling hands, surprised to find a spoon already laid across it. The beans were hot and well seasoned, filling her empty stomach with welcome warmth. Boone filled his own plate and sat in one of the chairs, eating in silence. But his eyes, when they met hers across the cabin, held none of the darkness she'd feared. Instead, she saw something that might have been concern, or perhaps understanding. For the first time since her uncle had left her at the livery, Lydia felt the knot of terror in her chest begin to loosen, just a little. Perhaps, just perhaps, she was safer here than she'd thought. The morning sun glinted off fresh snow as Boone led Lydia to the woodpile. He handed her a small hatchet, its wooden handle smooth from years of use. "Watch first," he said, demonstrating how to split a log into kindling. The wood cracked cleanly under his practiced stroke. Lydia's first attempts were clumsy. The hatchet glanced off the wood or stuck halfway through. Her arms trembled with the effort, and sweat dampened her hair despite the cold. But she kept trying, determined to prove herself useful. "Like this," Boone said quietly, adjusting her grip on the handle. Under his guidance, she finally managed to split a piece properly. He gave her a curt nod that made her stand straighter. Next came the creek, its surface crackling with thin ice. Boone showed her how to break through the ice at the deepest part, where the water still flowed beneath. The bucket was heavy when full, and water sloshed over Lydia's boots as she carried it back to the cabin. "Steady," Boone instructed. "Small steps." By her third trip, she'd learned to walk so the water barely rippled. In the afternoon, Boone checked his trap lines. He let Lydia watch as he mended a broken snare, his big fingers surprisingly nimble with the wire. When he handed it to her to try, she tangled the wire hopelessly. But Boone just unwound it patiently and showed her again. As the sun began to sink, Boone saddled the mule. "Need supplies," he said. "You're coming along." The ride into town was silent, except for the crunch of the mule's hooves in snow. Lydia's stomach tightened as they approached the mercantile. Inside, the warmth carried whispers that fell silent as they entered. Boone moved through the store efficiently, gathering flour, salt, and other necessities. Lydia tried to ignore the stares, but she couldn't block out the whispers that followed them down the aisles. "Poor thing. Living alone with that brute. He'll break her spirit, mark my words." Heat crept up Lydia's neck and into her cheeks. She busied herself examining a shelf of fabric, trying to hide her face. A tear slipped down her cheek, despite her efforts to hold it back. Outside, as Boone loaded their supplies, he caught sight of her tears. His jaw tightened. "Don't heed them," he muttered, roughly wiping her cheek with his sleeve. "They don't know nothing." Sunday morning brought a surprise. Boone emerged from behind the trunk wearing a clean shirt, his wild beard somewhat tamed. He held out a worn but carefully brushed coat to Lydia. "We're going to church," he announced. The one-room chapel was already full when they arrived. The singing of Amazing Grace faltered as heads turned to stare. Lydia slid into a back pew, feeling the weight of every eye upon them. Deacon Samuel Griggs stood at the front, his stern face darkening at their entrance. Instead of continuing the hymn, he strode down the aisle toward them. His hand closed around Lydia's arm, pulling her aside. "Girl," he said in a low voice that carried in the sudden silence, "you're not safe with him. Everyone knows his reputation, the violence in his past." Boone had been removing his hat, but at the deacon's words, his entire body stiffened. His knuckles whitened on the brim of his hat, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Lydia looked between them. The respected deacon and the feared mountain man who had shown her nothing but gruff kindness. The townspeople's whispers echoed in her mind. Was there truth in their warnings? What violence lay in Boone's past? The congregation watched, breath held, as Boone's hand tightened further on his hat. But he said nothing, only stood there, rigid as iron, while doubt crept into Lydia's heart. She studied his face, remembering his gentle hands showing her how to split wood, his patience with the tangled snare wire, the rough kindness of his sleeve against her tears. But the deacon's words had planted a seed of uncertainty that took root and grew. The silence stretched thin as a wire, ready to snap. Lydia stood frozen between them, the deacon's hand still on her arm, Boone's eyes now fixed on some distant point, his expression unreadable behind his beard. In that moment, She felt the weight of the town's judgment pressing down like a physical thing, and wondered if they were right about the man who had taken her in. The days grew shorter as winter deepened its grip on the mountain. Fresh snow fell nearly every night, transforming Boone's rough homestead into a white wonderland that sparkled in the weak sunlight. Lydia found herself settling into a rhythm with the quiet mountain man, each day bringing new tasks and small victories. One crisp morning, Boone showed her how to check the rabbit snares. Her fingers, though cold, worked the wire carefully just as he had taught her. When she successfully freed their first catch, his approving grunt meant more than any flowery praise could have. "You're learning," he said simply, watching her reset the trap with growing confidence. Back at the cabin, Lydia threw herself into domestic tasks. She scrubbed the iron pots until they gleamed, working out years of built-up grease. The physical labor warmed her, and she found satisfaction in each small improvement. When she discovered Boone's pile of torn flannels, she spent evenings by the fire carefully patching each one, her neat stitches closing the ragged holes. Boone began to speak more, though still in short bursts. He would mutter warnings about incoming storms, pointing to telltale clouds on the horizon. He taught her to recognize coyote calls and distinguish them from wolves. Sometimes in the evening, he would talk about the mountains themselves, where to find the sweetest spring water, or which slopes harbored the best hunting. Lydia soaked up every word, storing away his knowledge like precious gems. She noticed how his voice changed when he spoke of the land. It is nearer, softer, almost reverent. It was as if the mountains had become his family in place of whatever he had lost. One evening, as the lamp cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls, Lydia finally gathered her courage. Boone sat in his usual spot by the fire, knife and whetstone in hand. "Mr. Boone," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you get those scars?" His hands stilled on the whetstone. The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice rough as pine bark, he began to speak. "Was on the Platte Trail," he said slowly. "Freighting goods west. Had my wife Sarah with me. Our boy too, just turned 4. His fingers traced the long scar that ran from temple to jaw. Cholera hit the wagon camp. Started with the children first." Lydia held her breath, afraid any movement might stop his words. "Sarah wouldn't leave our boy's side. Then she took sick too." His eyes fixed on something distant, lost in memory. "I rode 3 days looking for a doctor. When I got back," his voice cracked, "I failed them. Should have been there. Should have." He fell silent, the unfinished thought hanging heavy in the air. Lydia's heart ached for the pain she heard in his voice. "My uncle," she found herself saying. "He told me no man would ever want me. Said I was too fat, too much trouble." She swallowed hard. "That is why he traded me. Said at least he could get something useful in exchange." Boone's head snapped up, something fierce flashing in his eyes. But the emotion seemed to make him uncomfortable, and he quickly looked away, reaching for his whetstone again. "Your uncle was a fool," he muttered, resuming his sharpening with quick, aggressive strokes. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the cabin corners like a surgeon's living thing. Lydia pulled her shawl tighter and added another log to the fire. Boone had retreated into his usual silence, but something had shifted between them, like ice breaking up on the creek. Later that night, after Lydia had gone to bed, Boone sat alone by the dying fire. The wind still moaned outside, rattling the shutters. For the first time in years, he felt the urge to pray. His hands, rough from work and weather, clasped awkwardly in his lap. "Lord," he whispered, then stopped, uncertain. The words felt foreign on his tongue after so long. He did not know if God still listened to someone who had turned away in anger and grief. But the girl's presence had awakened something in him, a need for more than just survival. He sat there in the flickering light, his prayer unspoken but felt deep in his heart. The wind continued its lonely song outside, but inside the cabin, something new had taken root, fragile as a spring seedling, but growing stronger with each passing day. The first hints of spring whispered through the mountain air. Patches of muddy earth emerged from beneath melting snow, and the creek's ice thinned enough to hear water music underneath. Inside the cabin, evenings stretched longer as daylight lingered, filling the small space with a gentle glow. One such evening, Lydia sat cross-legged by the fireplace, Boone's worn Bible open on her lap. Her mother had taught her letters years ago, spending precious evening hours tracing words in the dirt after chores. Now those lessons bore fruit as Lydia's clear voice filled the cabin. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read steadily. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Boone sat in his usual chair, hands still on his whittling. His eyes were closed, face relaxed in a way Lydia rarely saw. The familiar words seemed to smooth away some of his rough edges, like water wearing down stone. When the last light faded, she carefully closed the Bible, running her fingers over its cracked leather cover. "Ma always said reading was a gift," she said softly. "Said it would serve me well someday." Boone merely nodded, but his expression was thoughtful. The next morning brought warm sunshine that coaxed them outside. Boone showed Lydia a south-facing patch of ground where the soil had thawed enough to work. Together they prepared the earth for early potatoes, his strong hands breaking up the soil while she dropped cut pieces into the furrows. "Good eating come summer," he said, covering the last row. "If the frost don't take them." Lydia patted the dark earth hopefully. "They'll grow," she said with certainty. "This soil feels rich." That afternoon, they rode into town for supplies, their mules picking carefully along the muddy trail. The street was quiet, most folks still keeping indoors until the weather settled. They had nearly reached the mercantile when a stranger stepped into their path. He was a citified sort, wearing a bowler hat and a suit that seemed out of place against the muddy street. A watch chain glinted across his vest as he raised his hand to stop them. "Mr. Boone?" The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Mr. Caldwell, representing the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad." He pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat. "I have some matters to discuss regarding your property." Boone's face darkened. "My land's not for sale." "Oh, but you misunderstand." Caldwell's voice was smooth as creek ice. "These documents give the railroad right-of-way along your creek. The water rights are particularly valuable for our steam engines." He held out the papers. "Everything's quite legal, I assure you." Boone took the papers with stiff fingers, squinting at the dense writing. Lydia saw his jaw clench in frustration as he struggled to make sense of the legal language. "It's already settled," Caldwell said. "We begin surveying next week." Boone's hands tightened on the reins, knuckles white. For a moment, Lydia feared he might lash out. Instead, he turned his mule around without a word, leaving Caldwell smirking in the street. That evening, Boone sat at the rough table, the papers spread before him in the lamplight. His face was carved in stone, but Lydia saw the defeat in his shoulders. "Please," she said quietly. "Let me look." He pushed the papers toward her without speaking. Lydia pulled the lamp closer, carefully reading each page. Her finger traced the lines of tiny print, checking every detail as her mother had taught her. Suddenly she straightened. "Wait." She pulled one page closer. "Look here. The township mark is wrong." Her voice grew excited. "It says Township 7. But your land is in Township 5. This whole claim is for the wrong piece of ground." Boone stared at her, then at the paper where her finger pointed out the error. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then a sound rumbled from his chest. A laugh, rusty from disuse but genuine. "Girl," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "You just saved my land with your reading." Lydia felt warmth spread through her chest. All her life she had been told she was worthless, too big, too plain, too much of a burden. But here, in this moment, she had proved her uncle wrong. The railroad man with his fancy clothes and smooth words had been defeated by a skill her mother had given her with love and patience. Boone reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly. "Your ma taught you well," he said gruffly. "Reckon we both owe her thanks tonight." Lydia blinked back happy tears, remembering her mother's words. "Learning is a light, child. Keep it burning bright." That light had led her here, to this cabin, to this moment of triumph. The railroad man's papers lay revealed as worthless, and she had found her own worth at last. The next morning, Boone and Lydia rode into town, the railroad papers tucked securely in his coat. Spring sunshine warmed the muddy street as they made their way to the Western Union office where Caldwell had taken temporary quarters. The railroad agent's smug expression faded when Boone slapped the documents onto his desk. "There's a problem with your papers," Boone growled. Lydia stepped forward, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The township marking is incorrect, Mr. Caldwell. You've filed claim on land 5 miles north of Mr. Boone's property." Caldwell's face reddened as he snatched up the papers, scanning them quickly. "A simple clerical error," he blustered, adjusting his silk tie. "We can easily amend." "No," Boone cut him off. "You'll leave my land be." His massive frame seemed to fill the small office. "And my creek." Several townsfolk had gathered outside, pressing close to the window to watch. They'd never seen anyone stand up to the railroad men before, let alone succeed. Caldwell glanced at his audience, then back at the papers where Lydia's finger pointed to the damning evidence. "Very well," he said tightly, gathering his belongings. "The railroad will seek alternative arrangements." He swept out, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and defeat. Word spread quickly through Granite Bluff about how the mountain man's ward had outsmarted the railroad agent. Women who had previously crossed the street to avoid them now nodded politely. Even the mercantile owner offered Lydia a peppermint stick, free of charge. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. Lydia wore her freshly pressed dress, patched but clean, as she and Boone took their usual back pew in the small church. The morning light streamed through cloudy windows as Pastor Matthews led the congregation through opening prayers. During announcements, the pastor cleared his throat. "Miss Thompson," he said, "I understand you know many hymns. Would you honor us by leading one today?" Lydia froze, her heart thundering. Boone gave her a gentle nudge. Slowly, she stood and made her way to the front, feeling every eye upon her. The familiar weight of judgment pressed down, too big, too plain, too much. But then she remembered her mother's words. "Sing from your heart, child. That's where true beauty lives." Taking a deep breath, she began, "Rock of Ages." Her voice trembled on the first note, then grew stronger, filling the small space with clear, sweet tones. "Rock of Ages, cleft for me. Let me hide myself in thee." The congregation shifted uncomfortably at first, unused to such a young voice leading worship. But as Lydia continued, her confidence growing with each verse, something in the atmosphere changed. Her voice soared to the rough-hewn rafters, carrying years of faith and hope despite hardship. When the final note faded, silence held for a moment before scattered applause broke out. Mrs. Wilson, a widow who had lost her husband to mountain fever last winter, reached out and patted Lydia's hand as she returned to her seat. "You've a gift, child," she whispered, her eyes warm with approval. Boone sat straighter in his pew, his weathered face softened with something that looked remarkably like pride. He'd seen the gradual change in how people looked at Lydia now, not with pity or scorn, but with growing respect. That evening, as sunset painted the mountain peaks in gold, Lydia burst through the cabin door, her face glowing with excitement. "I caught one," she exclaimed, holding up a plump rabbit caught in her snare. "All by myself." Boone examined her handiwork, noting the proper knots and careful placement. "Good clean kill," he approved. "You're learning fast." Lydia beamed at the praise, already planning the stew she would make. As she cleaned her catch with growing skill, she hummed Rock of Ages under her breath, her voice mixing with the evening bird songs. Watching her work, Boone felt an unfamiliar sensation in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it as contentment. The cabin that had been silent for so many years now rang with Lydia's voice and laughter. The garden held promise of summer vegetables. The railroad threat had passed. Without warning, a smile spread across his face, not the slight quirk of lips he sometimes managed, but a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Lydia caught sight of it and stared in wonder before breaking into delighted laughter. "You should smile more often," she told him boldly. "It suits you." Boone ducked his head, embarrassed but still smiling. The evening air was sweet with spring promise, and for the first time in years, life felt almost good. Spring's warmth crept into the mountain cabin, chasing away winter's lingering chill. Sunlight streamed through the single window, catching dust motes that danced above the rough-hewn floorboards. The days stretched longer, filling the small space with golden evening light that made even the simplest things beautiful. Boone sat at his workbench, carefully sanding a wooden stool he'd built for Lydia. His large hands, usually more suited to trapping and hunting, moved with surprising gentleness over the smooth pine. He'd noticed how she struggled to reach the higher shelves, and something in him had stirred with the need to help. "It's perfect," Lydia exclaimed when he presented it to her, running her fingers over the polished seat. She immediately put it to use, reaching up to organize the dried herbs they'd gathered together. Later that week, Boone spent evenings carefully carving a small wooden cross. Each stroke of his knife was deliberate, transforming a simple piece of pine into something sacred. When finished, he placed it quietly by Lydia's bedside while she was out gathering eggs. That night, she traced its careful lines with wonder, tears gleaming in her eyes. Their evening routine had shifted too. Now, before eating their simple suppers of beans and cornbread, they joined hands and prayed together. Lydia's clear voice gave thanks for their food, their home, and their newfound family. Boone's amen grew stronger each night, his faith rekindling like spring grass after winter's frost. One evening, as they sat by the crackling fire, Lydia spoke softly. "I want to be a schoolteacher someday," she confided, hugging her knees to her chest. "Ma always said learning was precious. I'd like to share that with others." Boone looked up from where he was mending a harness. "You're already teaching," he said gruffly. "What do you mean?" "Teaching me," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Teaching me to hope again. Hadn't done that in years before you came." Lydia's face lit up with joy, and her laugh rang through the cabin like music. Soon Boone's deeper chuckle joined in, the sound strange but welcome to his own ears. The firelight danced across their faces as they shared the simple pleasure of belonging. But in town, shadows gathered. Whispers followed them down the boardwalk, darting between shop windows and behind raised hands. Deacon Griggs watched their Sunday attendance with narrowed eyes, his disapproval a dark cloud in the church's peace. One afternoon, as Boone loaded supplies into his saddlebags outside the mercantile, the deacon approached. His black coat seemed to absorb the spring sunshine, leaving him in shadow. "Brother Boone," he said, though there was no warmth in the title. "A word, if you please." Boone straightened slowly, his scarred face impassive. "Folks are talking," Griggs continued, his voice low but sharp. "It ain't right. A man your age keeping a young girl. People suspect sin." Boone's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the leather of his gloves creaking. For a moment, the old rage rose in him like a storm. But he thought of Lydia's gentle prayers, her trust in him. Without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving the deacon standing in the dusty street. Back at the cabin, Lydia was unaware of the town's dark mutterings. She hummed as she worked in their small garden, teaching Boone the songs her mother had sung. The potato plants were sprouting, and she'd planted beans along the south wall. That evening, as they sat together by the fire, she spoke of her dreams. "Someday," she said, stirring the beans in their iron pot, "no one will call me burden anymore." Her voice held no bitterness, only hope. Boone watched her, this girl who had brought light back into his dark world. She moved about their home with growing confidence, her presence filling empty corners with warmth. The fire crackled merrily, sending sparks up the chimney into the darkening sky. The bond between them was unmistakable now. Not the love of man and woman that the town suspected, but something purer. It was the love of a father who had found his child, a family built not from blood but from choice and grace and second chances. As night settled over the mountain, their laughter echoed once more through the cabin, drowning out the distant whispers of those who would not understand. In this moment, their small home held all the peace they needed. A sanctuary built of trust and shared prayers and simple gifts carved by caring hands. Summer settled over the mountain like a warm blanket, painting the landscape in vibrant greens and wild mountain flowers. The days stretched long and golden, filled with shared work and quiet companionship. Boone and Lydia fell into an easy rhythm, their movements around each other as natural as breathing. In the cool morning hours, they split wood together. Boone demonstrated the proper stance, his massive hands adjusting Lydia's grip on the smaller axe he'd found for her. "Let the weight do the work," he instructed, watching as she struggled with the motion. Though her strikes weren't as powerful as his, she managed to split enough kindling to feel proud. Their small garden flourished under their combined care. Lydia had an eye for spotting weeds and insects that might harm their precious vegetables. She'd sing softly while they worked, old hymns and folk songs that made Boone's weather-worn face soften with memory. The potato plants grew tall and strong, their flowers promising a good harvest come fall. On particularly hot afternoons, they'd make their way down to the creek where Boone taught her the patience of fishing. She'd watch, fascinated, as his scarred hands tied delicate knots in fishing line and showed her how to read the water's movement. "Look there," he'd say, pointing to a shadowy spot beneath an overhanging bank. "That's where the big ones rest." One memorable morning, Boone decided it was time Lydia learned to ride his old mule. The animal, usually as stern as its master, seemed to gentle beneath her tentative touch. Boone led them around the yard, his hands steady on the bridle as Lydia wobbled in the saddle. "I feel like I'm on top of the world," she exclaimed, though she clutched the saddle horn with white knuckles. Her attempts at posting were awkward, and she bounced more than rode, but her laughter rang out pure and joyful across the mountain meadow. Even the mule seemed to take her clumsiness in stride, plodding along with patient steps. The day everything changed started like any other. They'd ridden into town for supplies, the summer heat pressing down like a physical weight. Lydia had been quieter than usual during their trip, her face flushed pink despite the shade of her bonnet. On their return journey, she swayed in her saddle. "Lydia?" Boone called, noticing her unusual silence. Before she could answer, she slumped forward, sliding from the mule like a rag doll. Boone's heart stopped as he lunged to catch her before she hit the ground. Her skin burned against his palms, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. With gentle urgency, he gathered her in his arms and carried her the rest of the way home. Her head lolled against his chest, reminding him terribly of another time, another precious burden he'd carried. Inside the cabin, he laid her carefully on her bed, his hands shaking as he pulled the quilt up to her chin. Boone rode hard into town for the doctor, pushing his mule faster than the bed animal had moved in years. The sun was setting by the time he returned with Dr. Morrison, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. The doctor's examination was thorough, but his expression grew grimmer with each passing moment. He checked her pulse, listened to her labored breathing, and felt the heat radiating from her skin. Finally, he straightened and shook his head, his words falling like stones in the quiet cabin. "Not much to be done," he said softly. "Her body's weak. These fevers." He left the rest unsaid, packing away his instruments with careful movements that spoke of too much practice delivering bad news. After the doctor left, Boone pulled his stool beside Lydia's bed. Outside, night crept across the mountain, but he barely noticed. He dipped a cloth in cool water again and again, wiping the sweat from her brow as she tossed in fevered dreams. "Don't leave me," he whispered, his voice rough with fear. "Please, child, don't leave." The hours crawled by like years. Each of Lydia's shallow breaths seemed fainter than the last. In the flickering lamplight, memories crashed over Boone like waves. His wife, Sarah's face, twisted with pain as the cholera took her. His little James, too weak even to cry at the end. He'd buried them beside the Platte Trail, marking their graves with stones before walking away from everything he'd ever loved. Now, watching Lydia struggle for each breath, those old wounds tore open fresh. His massive hands, capable of breaking men in his darker days, felt useless against this invisible enemy. He pressed them together in desperate prayer, words he thought he'd forgotten tumbling from his lips in the darkness. "Lord," he pleaded, "not again. Please, not again." Sweat rolled down Lydia's flushed face as she burned with fever, while Boone kept his vigil, fighting against the memories that threatened to drown him in grief. Days melted together like snow in spring thaw. Boone measured time only by the rise and fall of pass, Lydia's labored breathing, and the changing light that filtered through the cabin's single window. He kept the fire stoked, though summer heat pressed against the walls. His own needs faded to nothing as he focused solely on keeping her alive. Every hour, he spooned thin broth between her cracked lips, watching anxiously as drops spilled down her chin. His large hands, more accustomed to breaking trail than providing tender care, trembled as he worked. The familiar prayers of his childhood tumbled from his lips, rough and unpracticed but sincere. "Our Father," he whispered, dabbing her forehead with a damp cloth. "Who art in heaven?" The words felt strange on his tongue after so many silent years. Word of Lydia's illness spread through town like wildfire. Visitors came, standing awkwardly at the door with covered dishes and whispered concerns. Behind their sympathy, darker murmurs circulated. Some said it was divine judgment on Boone for keeping a young girl. Others claimed his godless ways had brought this curse upon them both. The deacon's wife brought chicken soup and sharp words wrapped in false kindness. "Perhaps if you'd let her stay with proper Christian folk," she began. But Boone's thunderous look sent her scurrying back to town. 4 days into the fever, Boone sat slumped beside Lydia's bed, his massive frame bent with exhaustion. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his beard had grown wild and unkempt. He hadn't slept more than snatches, afraid she'd slip away while he dozed. Taking her small, damp hand in his calloused one, he finally broke. "I can't lose you too," he choked out, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. "Not like Sarah, not like little James. Please, child." The sound of hoofbeats outside barely registered until a shadow darkened the doorway. Boone looked up to find Henry Nez standing there, straight-backed and dignified in the fading light. The Navajo healer's dark eyes took in the scene without judgment. Boone's throat tightened. 3 years had passed since their bitter quarrel, when he'd mocked Henry's traditional medicines and healing ceremonies. Pride and whiskey had loosened his tongue that day, leading him to say things that couldn't be unsaid. They hadn't spoken since. "I heard of the sickness," Henry said simply, his voice as calm as mountain water. "The spirits brought me word." Boone stood, swaying slightly from exhaustion. "Why would you help? After what I said?" Henry's gaze settled on Lydia's feverish form. "The child is innocent of old quarrels. But I will only help if you can humble yourself, admit you're wrong, and respect our ways." The old Boone would have bristled at the condition, would have let his pride drive away help as it had so many times before. But 4 days of watching Lydia fade had broken something in him, scraped away his harsh exterior to reveal the desperate heart beneath. Slowly, deliberately, Boone bowed his head. "I was wrong," he said, the words rough but clear. "I spoke from ignorance and hate. I apologize for mocking your traditions." He looked up, meeting Henry's steady gaze. "Please, help her." Henry studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. From his medicine bag, he began removing bundles of herbs and sacred items. His movements were precise, practiced, as he set up what he needed. "Build up the fire," he instructed. "We will need hot water." Through the night, Henry worked tirelessly. He brewed strong-smelling teas from herbs Boone didn't recognize, singing soft prayers in his native tongue as he worked. He placed warm stones around Lydia's body and waved sweet-smelling smoke over her with an eagle feather. Hour after hour, he alternated between Christian prayers and traditional healing songs, bridging 2 worlds of faith. Boone watched and helped when asked, handing Henry what he needed without question or comment. His own prayers joined Henry's, harmony finding its way between their different traditions. Outside, coyotes sang to the rising moon, their voices weaving with the healing chants that filled the cabin. As midnight passed, Henry paused in his work, looking at Boone with knowing eyes. "Sometimes the greatest medicine is admitting we need help," he said quietly. "Pride can poison the spirit as surely as bad water poisons the body." Boone nodded, understanding flowing between them. The night stretched on, filled with prayer, hope, and the first tentative threads of reconciliation. Through the deepening night, Henry worked with steady hands and unwavering focus. He brewed tea after tea, each batch darker and more bitter than the last. The pungent smell of medicinal herbs filled the cabin as steam rose from the cooking pot. Boone watched, passing cloths and kettles when asked, his eyes never leaving Lydia's face. "This will help break the fever," Henry explained softly, lifting Lydia's head to give her sips of the medicine. "Small amounts, often. Like rain on dry earth." Boone nodded, his throat tight as he watched Henry's gentle care. The memory of their last meeting rose up like bitter smoke, himself drunk and angry, mocking Henry's primitive medicine and heathen ways. The shame of it burned in his chest. "Henry," he said roughly, while they waited for water to boil. "That day at Thompson's Creek, what I said about your people, your healing. He struggled with the words, unused to admitting wrong. I was speaking from ignorance and hate. I dishonored you and your traditions. Henry's hands remained steady as he crushed dried leaves in a wooden bowl. Words spoken in anger are like arrows, he said quietly. They can wound deeply. I know that now, Boone replied, his voice heavy with regret. I ask your forgiveness, if you can give it. Henry looked up then, meeting Boone's eyes. Mercy is not weakness, he said. It takes more strength to forgive than to hold on to hatred. I forgave you long ago, friend. The word friend struck Boone like a physical blow. He bowed, his head humbled by the grace being shown to him. Through the long hours, they worked together. Henry chanted prayers in his native tongue, while Boone murmured the biblical verses he remembered from childhood. Their different traditions blended in the dim cabin, united in purpose. Outside, an owl called 3 times, a sign of change, Henry said. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, Lydia stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. Boone? The big man's composure cracked. Tears spilled freely down his weathered cheeks as he gripped her small hand in both of his. I'm here, child. I'm right here. Henry smiled quietly, continuing his work. Through the morning hours, he spooned more medicine into Lydia, bathed her face with cool cloths, and sang healing songs. By evening, when the shadows grew long across the cabin floor, her fever finally broke. The dangerous heat left her body like a departing storm, leaving her weak but clear-eyed. Boone turned to Henry, his gratitude too deep for words. Take my bay horse, he offered gruffly. The one with the white star. He's young and strong, a fair payment for saving her life. But Henry shook his head, gathering his medicine bags. I did not come for payment, he said. Seeing you bend your pride was worth more than any horse. He smiled slightly. Besides, my people know that healing is not a trade. It is a gift we pass on, like water in the desert. With quiet dignity, Henry stepped out into the twilight. Boone followed him to the door, watching until the healer's form disappeared into the gathering dusk. When he returned to Lydia's bedside, she was looking at him with tired but knowing eyes. You prayed for me, she whispered, a small smile touching her lips. Boone ducked his head, embarrassed but not denying it. Reckon I did, he admitted. Prayed harder than I ever have before. She reached for his hand, her grip weak but warm. In the soft evening light, they sat together, changed by what had passed between them. Outside, a lone coyote called, a single, clear note that spoke of healing and hope. The cabin was different now, Boone realized. It felt cleansed, not just of sickness but of old ghosts and bitter pride. Henry's forgiveness and Lydia's survival had worked a deeper healing than either medicine or prayer alone could achieve. As darkness settled over the mountain, Boone felt gratitude fill his heart, for mercy given, for pride broken, and for the chance to begin again. Days stretched into weeks as Lydia May slowly regained her strength. Each morning, Boone would stoke the fire before dawn, setting a pot of broth to simmer with dried meat and the last summer vegetables from their small garden. The rich aroma would fill their cabin, drawing Lydia from fitful sleep. Small sips, Boone would say, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her hold the tin cup. Henry said not to rush it. Though weak as a newborn colt, Lydia found comfort in these quiet moments. Boone had pulled her bed closer to the hearth, where she could watch the flames dance and feel their warmth. He kept her supplied with fresh water from the creek, making 3 or 4 trips daily with heavy buckets that sloshed against his legs. In the evenings, something remarkable happened. Boone, who once communicated mainly in grunts and scowls, began reading aloud from his worn Bible. His voice, rough from years of disuse, stumbled over the longer words, but Lydia didn't mind. She would close her eyes and let the familiar verses wash over her like a healing balm. The Lord is my shepherd, he would read, lamplight flickering across his scarred face. I shall not want. As autumn painted the mountainside in brilliant reds and golds, Lydia's strength returned bit by bit. Her first steps were wobbly, like a fawn finding its legs. Boone stayed close, his arms steady as an oak branch as she learned to walk again. They would make slow circuits around the cabin, each day venturing a little further. Look there, Boone would say, pointing to a jay or squirrel. These small distractions helped her forget the trembling in her legs, the exhaustion that came too quickly. The biggest change, though, was in their meals. Where before they had eaten in silence, Boone now bowed his head and spoke words of thanks. His prayers were simple, sometimes awkward, but they came from a heart cracked open by grace. "Lord," he would say, "thank you for this food, for healing, for..." Here he would always pause, glancing at Lydia. "For second chances." As the aspens turned golden and the nights grew crisp, Lydia felt strong enough to attempt the journey to church. That Sunday morning, Boone helped her into her freshly pressed dress, the same one she had worn months ago when fever took her. The ride into town was slow, with Boone leading the mule carefully over every rough patch. When they reached the white-painted church, heads turned and whispers rose. But these weren't the suspicious murmurs of before. These were sounds of welcome, of relief. Lydia's legs shook as she stood for the first hymn. Boone's steady presence beside her gave her courage. When she opened her mouth to sing Amazing Grace, her voice rang out clear and true, stronger than it had ever been. For a moment, she sang alone, the notes floating up to the rough-hewn rafters. Then something wonderful happened. One by one, other voices joined in. First the widow Johnson, then the blacksmith's wife, until the whole congregation lifted their voices together. The harmony swelled, filling every corner of the small church with joy and praise. Boone stood with his head bowed, but Lydia caught the glint of tears in his eyes. Across the aisle, Deacon Griggs watched them. The man who had once warned against Boone's character now nodded slowly, a gesture of respect that spoke louder than words. After the service, people gathered around them on the church steps. Women pressed small gifts into Lydia's hands, a jar of preserves, a knitted shawl. Men clapped Boone on the shoulder, their previous fear of him forgotten in the face of his transformed spirit. "Welcome back, child," the pastor's wife said, embracing Lydia. "We've been praying for you." The autumn sun warmed their faces as they made their way home, riding side by side. Lydia held the shawl close, breathing in the crisp mountain air. In the distance, an eagle soared on rising thermals, free and strong. "You sang beautiful today," Boone said quietly. Lydia smiled, remembering the way the congregation had joined her voice. "We all did," she replied. Together, back at the cabin, Boone helped her down from the mule. Before going inside, they paused to look at the mountains, painted in autumn glory. The fear and suspicion that had once surrounded them had melted away like spring snow, replaced by something warmer and truer. Boone's rough voice broke the silence. "Thank you, Lord," he said simply, "for bringing us home." The mountain air turned crisp and clean as autumn settled over the cabin. Boone stood in the yard one morning, studying the worn walls of their home with new eyes. His gaze traveled from the patched roof to the cramped interior visible through the open door. Change was needed. "Reckon it's time for some improvements," he said, scratching his chin thoughtfully. Lydia looked up from where she scattered corn for their 3 scrawny chickens. "What kind of improvements?" she asked, brushing dust from her apron. Boone gestured with his calloused hands. "Second bed, proper like. You need your own, not just the one I threw together when you were sick. And this garden." He walked to the small plot they'd scratched out in spring. "Could be twice the size come planting time. More chickens too." Lydia's face brightened. "Really? Our own bigger garden?" "Our own," Boone confirmed, the words feeling right in his mouth. He pulled out a worn pencil and scrap of paper, sketching rough plans as Lydia peered over his arm. Together they marked spots for new fence posts and calculated lumber needed for the bed. The work began that very day. Boone showed Lydia how to strip bark from fresh-cut pine logs, their laughter echoing across the yard as she made a mess of her first attempt. She proved better at measuring the boards, her careful eye matching lengths perfectly. "You're a natural," Boone said, pride warming his voice as she marked another straight line. Their days fell into a pleasant rhythm. Mornings meant chores, feeding chickens, hauling water, checking Boone's trap lines. Afternoons they devoted to their improvements, working side by side in the golden autumn light. Lydia learned to drive nails without hitting her thumb, mostly, while Boone discovered an unexpected patience in teaching. Every few days they rode into town for supplies. At the general store, Boone laid out his pelts on the counter while Lydia stepped outside. A group of children playing marbles on the boardwalk called out to her. "Come show us that game you were telling us about," little Tommy Baker shouted. Lydia joined them, showing how to draw the circle just so, her cheerful voice carrying through the open door as she explained the rules. Boone paused in his bargaining to watch, something tight in his chest loosening at the sight. Widow Johnson, arranging dried goods on a shelf nearby, followed his gaze. "Well now," she said softly, "looks like you found yourself a daughter, Ephraim Boone." The word struck him like summer lightning. Daughter. He'd been so focused on protecting Lydia, providing for her, he hadn't named what was growing between them. But there it was, simple as sunrise. That evening, they sat by the hearth as darkness gathered outside. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Lydia worked on mending one of Boone's shirts, her neat stitches closing a torn seam. Across from her, Boone's knife moved, steadily over a piece of pine, whittling what would become a new handle for their water bucket. The peaceful silence wrapped around them like a familiar quilt. Lydia tied off her thread and held up the shirt for inspection. "Do you think it'll hold?" "Stronger than before," Boone assured her, testing the seam with gentle fingers. Lydia folded the shirt carefully, then looked up at him with those clear, honest eyes that saw straight through to his soul. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about how I ended up here, with you." Boone set down his whittling, giving her his full attention. "I think," she continued, voice barely above a whisper, "I think God gave me to you." The words hung in the firelit air between them, pure and true as a mountain stream. Boone felt moisture gather in his eyes, remembering all the dark, lonely years before this girl brought light back into his life. "And you to me," he replied, voice rough with emotion. Lydia's smile bloomed like the first spring flower after winter. She rose from her chair and crossed to where he sat, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders. Boone pulled her close, breathing in the scent of soap and wool and home. They stayed that way for a long moment, the fire popping softly beside them. No more words were needed. What had started as an act of desperate charity had transformed into something sacred, a family forged not by blood but by love, by choice, by God's own hand. When they finally parted, both wiping eyes and smiling, the bond between them was as solid as the mountain itself. Father and daughter, given to each other by grace, making something new and beautiful from broken pieces. The first winter snowflakes drifted down like feathers, coating the mountain in pristine white. Inside their cabin, Boone and Lydia worked with quiet purpose, preparing for the cold months ahead. "Stack them tight against the wall," Boone instructed as they moved split logs into the covered woodshed. "Snow'll drift. Hard come January." Lydia nodded, her breath visible in the chilly air. They'd spent days gathering and chopping wood until the pile stood taller than Boone himself. In the root cellar, burlap sacks bulged with potatoes they'd harvested, while strips of venison and rabbit meat hung drying from the rafters. Their preparation didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Baker appeared one morning with a steaming apple pie, and Widow Johnson brought a heavy sack of flour. Even the mercantile owner's wife stopped by with preserved peaches, her eyes widening at their neat, well-stocked cabin. "You've made quite a home here," she said, genuine warmth in her voice. One stormy Sunday morning, snow whirled thick through the air as Boone helped Lydia mount their old mule. He'd wrapped her in 2 wool blankets against the bitter wind, and her cheeks glowed pink above her scarf. "Hold tight now," he cautioned, adjusting the reins in her mittened hands. They made their way carefully down the snowy trail, Boone walking beside the mule, steadying it through deeper drifts. The church windows glowed golden through the storm. As they stamped snow from their boots on the steps, the door opened wide. Warm greetings welcomed them inside, where the pot-bellied stove radiated heat through the single room. "Lydia May," the preacher called out as the congregation settled into their pews. "We'd be blessed to have you lead us in amazing grace this morning." She looked up at Boone, who gave an encouraging nod. Standing straight and tall, Lydia's clear voice rose pure as sunlight through the church. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." The familiar words took wing, and something extraordinary happened. Boone, the scarred giant who'd once struck fear in every heart, bowed his graying head and joined her song. His deep bass rumbled beneath her sweet soprano, rough-edged but sincere. One by one, other voices joined in, weaving together like a tapestry of sound. The harmony swelled, filling every corner of the 7-little church with joy. Mrs. Baker dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. The deacon's wife reached over to squeeze Lydia's shoulder. When the final note faded, silence held for a breath before the preacher spoke. Amen. Boone felt Lydia's small hand slip into his calloused palm. Looking down at her radiant face, he saw all his reasons for gratitude reflected there. Mercy, redemption, and the miracle of belonging. Spring burst across the Colorado mountains in a riot of wildflowers and birdsong. Patches of snow still clung to the highest peaks, but down in Granite Bluff, warm sunshine bathed the town in golden light. The morning air held the sweet scent of renewal as Boone and Lydia May rode side by side down the main street. Boone sat tall in his saddle, his weathered face peaceful beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Beside him, Lydia perched confidently on their faithful mule, her once-patched dress replaced by a neat calico frock she'd sewn herself. Their approach no longer emptied the boardwalks or stirred fearful whispers. Instead, friendly calls rang out from every direction. "Morning, Boone. Morning, Lydia May." Mrs. Baker waved from the mercantile steps. The blacksmith touched his cap respectfully. "Fine day for riding." Even the sheriff, who'd once viewed Boone with suspicion, offered a hearty greeting. "Good to see you both." They dismounted at the hitching post outside the whitewashed church. Inside, morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, painting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. The congregation filled the space with quiet conversation and warm smiles. No one shifted away when Boone and Lydia took their usual seat near the middle. The preacher stood at his pulpit, Bible open before him, and gazed out at his flock with joy. His voice carried clear and strong through the hushed church. Psalm 118 tells us, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." He gestured toward Boone and Lydia. "Look how he works, in mysterious ways, bringing light from darkness, joy from sorrow, family from loneliness." Boone's throat tightened with emotion. He reached for Lydia's hand, engulfing it in his large, calloused palm. She squeezed back, her eyes bright with happy tears. The fearsome mountain man who'd once kept the whole town at bay now sat openly moved, his heart full to bursting with gratitude. After the service, they rode home through meadows dotted with early columbines. Their little cabin waited, no longer the stark shelter of a solitary man, but a true home. Cheerful curtains, sewn by Lydia, framed the windows. A neat vegetable patch stretched behind the house, promising summer bounty. Even the woodpiles stood orderly, split and stacked by their combined effort. Boone helped Lydia down from the mule, then stood gazing across the valley. The view hadn't changed: the same rugged peaks, the same winding creek, the same distant forests. But he saw it all differently now. Where bitter memories had once haunted every shadow, he found only peace. The ghosts of his past had finally found rest. He lifted his eyes to the vast Colorado sky, whispering words that came straight from his heart. "Thank you, Lord, for sending her." Lydia moved close, leaning against his side. She fit there perfectly, like she'd always belonged. The girl the town had labeled a burden, the child her own uncle had traded away, now stood tall and proud. Her presence had transformed not just Boone's life, but his very soul. She smiled up at him, this daughter of his heart, and Boone marveled at how God's mercy had worked through her. The feared mountain man, scarred inside and out, had found his redemption in the most unexpected place: the brave spirit of a young girl others had cast aside. Together, they walked toward their cabin, where laughter and light had replaced loneliness, where hope bloomed as surely as the spring flowers dotting the mountainside. Each step carried them forward into the blessing of their shared life, a testament to the power of love to heal all wounds. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow, I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.